Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Hi, friends. There are so many reasons why I am so happy to talk to Nisha Coleman today. Hi, Nisha. How are you?
Hi, Brune. I'm very well.
Cool. So you are currently in Ottawa?
Yep, I'm in Ottawa.
And I am in Toronto, and you usually live in Montreal. Like, it depends. But that is where we met a couple years ago. And you were my storytelling teacher for a few weeks. And it was wonderful. So I wanted to chat with you today because you are a storytelling producer for Confabulation and Enfabulation in Montreal, which is the French sister show of Confabulation. Can you tell us how you became a producer?
I guess I became a producer just by telling stories enough at the show, at Confabulation, that they invited me to be part of their team. It was sort of an organic progression from being a regular storyteller to helping other people tell their stories. So I didn't apply or even imply that I should be a producer, but they were looking for new people to help and be on the team. And so they asked me, and I was, I think I was at the point where I wanted something like that. So it was good timing.
Yeah.
I sometimes get tired of my own stories, and it's nice to be able to help other people find their stories and in some cases find their voice if they've never told a story before.
I love that. A few months ago, before I started Bodies of Stories, I was having this feeling of it would be so great to work on other people's stories. And I was thinking, I don't have the right network for maybe someone to hire me to do that, or if I want that, I need some experience doing it. So I just started doing it for myself. But I can relate to the feeling of okay, I am in my own head with my stories. I want to know about other people. And especially first time storytellers it's so great to work with them. And you know what, so during the workshop 2 years ago, you helped me work on my story, and what happened was that I couldn't make it to the final showcase of the workshop because I had to go to Europe for a couple of weeks, and then I've been trying to work on that story ever since. I think it's not ready to be told, and that's just what it is.
Yeah, that happens sometimes.
Yeah, I think I have found some sort of resolution just 3 months ago, but so I still have to let it breathe and live, and then maybe one day. So all of this to say that some stories are take a long time to be ready to be told.
And sometimes we'll get pitches from someone who's just lived this traumatic event, or they've lost someone very close to them, and they feel that they're ready to tell the story. But oftentimes you start talking to them and it's so fresh and raw, and they realize pretty quickly that it's not ready to be told. It's not being processed. And so stories have sometimes their own timeline, and you can't always force it. And if you do, what often happens is that the storyteller drops out very close to the day of the show. So I have sort of a radar now of when I meet with the person to try and figure out, if the story is too real or too raw, because I don't want them to force it. I don't want them to feel like they have to process this story, fast forward the processing stage to be able to get it ready. And I don't want them to have to drop out close to the show. It's not good for either of us.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to respect the story.
Mm-hmm. And so that's your process. So you meet with them and you chat about, okay, what's the story? And you look for the heart of the story. How, and then from there to the stage, how do you do it?
It so depends. It's always sort of different depending on the person, how much experience they have. Sometimes the story just is one of those stories that tells itself. Like the structure is already there. The core of the story is pretty inherent within the event. Other times it's trickier. If it covers a long period of time, for example, I have to sit down with the person and we work through the timeline, and then we have to figure out what scenes we can pull out of the story. And sometimes what happens with first timers is they're not used to thinking in scenes, and so there's no scene at all. It's just a big, long telling of like, you know, it could be even over 10 years, or like, you know, someone might come to me with like, I want to tell a story about growing up with, you know, a schizophrenic mother, and that's a very interesting premise, and I want to hear that story. But then the next stage is finding what scenes within that, you know, 10 to 15 year period are going to illustrate what that's actually like. So it's often honing in on the most meaningful scenes that will piece together into the whole of the puzzle that is the story.
Yeah.
It can be a long process sometimes, or like I said, sometimes it just flows very naturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then do you ask them to put something in writing afterwards, or
that also depends on the person. Some people are more inclined to write down their story, other people are more oral.
Yeah.
So I give them the option. They can send me a text or they can send me a recording. And either way, I can provide notes for them. Or if it's someone who's quite nervous or it's their first time and they're a little unsure, we'll just meet again. And then go through it in person. Because I think that transition from the page or from just the one-on-one to the stage can sometimes be really intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
And so that second get-together, I find, can be quite helpful, because now they have the story, it's in the structure is coming along, they know how they're going to tell it. So now it's a matter of feeling natural when you're like in front of a bunch of people and there's lights in your face and a microphone in front of your mouth. And for a lot of people, that's the first time they've ever done anything close to that.
Yeah.
So I'll walk them through it, like, you know, set the scene, like, okay, imagine that, you know, it's dark, you can't see very many people. Now the lights are in your eyes, you have the mic, you're on, like, just to kind of get them in the ambience.
Yeah.
It can be, you know, it can be really disorienting for some people.
Yeah. And now they have to do it in front of their screen, which is a whole other endeavor.
Now I'm setting them up for that. Like you'll see your face. You won't have the audience, like just getting ready for that, especially for people that are used to performing. Now it's the performers that are having trouble because they're used to that feedback.
Yeah. They can have the audience on their screen though. It's just a choice.
Yes.
Yeah. Or they can also choose just one person in the audience and put them full screen, like a friendly face, and be like, okay, I'm talking to my friend. Or
That's what I was telling my storytellers for the Enfabulation, was pick a face that's quite expressive, so that you can sort of at least have that to play off of.
Yeah.
That you feel like there's some feedback happening, because people that are used to that, then it's, you know, it's the more seasoned performers I find that are thrown more than than a first timer in this transition to the online storytelling.
Yeah. And so let's talk about Enfabulation, because one of the reasons I'm very happy to talk to you today and to bring this piece of conversation to people who are interested in storytelling is that I come from France. I moved to Montreal 3 years ago, and storytelling, the art form of live storytelling, does not exist in France. I think just culturally, it's not part of the culture to put ourselves out there in a vulnerable way. If you go on stage, you have to have credentials or to be a stand-up comedian or to be famous for any sort of reason. So yeah, like back then I was listening to storytelling podcasts in English, and I was like, oh, I wish I could just go attend a show. And so when I moved to Montreal and I went to Confabulation for the first time, I was really happy. And then I was hooked, which is a common side effect of going to a show. But it's interesting because ever since I started telling stories on stage in English, I've never told any story in French yet. I've been trying to explain to my friends who live in France the concept and why it's so great and why everyone should do it. And you, okay, so Confabulation started the show Enfabulation pretty recently. Was it a year ago or something?
It's been, I believe, 2 years.
Okay.
Possibly more, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about how it's going.
So your story is similar to Juliana, who's the main sort of founder of Enfabulation. She came to one show at Confabulation and was like, oh my goodness, this has to happen in French. So it was actually her initiative to start the show in French. She did it all on her own. And then she was running the show, single-handedly, but then needed some help because it's, as you know, it's a big job, especially when you're workshopping all these stories yourself. And so that's why I started on her team workshopping in French. And it's a similar phenomenon in the French side of Canada, I think. It's not part of the culture to tell true stories. It's just not. Like there's a culture of conte, of storytelling, but more traditional. Yeah. And so that's why we don't call them conte in French, because it will most likely be confused with the traditional storytelling that's so a part of the culture. So it really was a new introduction to the form. And so it's taken a while, because you have to get someone to come to the show to really understand the value of it. Even when you explain what it is, it's hard to truly grasp the power of what it's like to witness someone telling a powerful story, or a story that's meaningful, or I think you can only truly get it once you're there. And that's what happens. So people come to the show and then they understand, and then they want to come back, or they want to tell a story themselves, and they really enjoy it. But the struggle has been getting people to come to the shows not knowing what it is. So it takes a while to build an audience, especially with a new art form. So that's been our challenge since the start. But it's been really rewarding to see people experience this art form for the first time, which is not something I really saw in Confabulation, because they have their audience and they come back and there's a whole community. But with Confabulation, I would speak to people who had never been to a show before, and just how moved they were, or the whole audience, in tears because of one story, and then, rumbling with laughter for the next story. And just really, it's a way to experience another life almost. You're living that story with the storyteller. And so that's been, I think, my favorite aspect of working on the Enfabulation team.
Yeah.
Is, you know, introducing people to this for the first time.
Yes, you are an activist of storytelling and you're showing the way. It's great. Isn't it interesting that there's no word in French for storytelling?
Yeah, it is. Like we just say storytelling, just a little French twist, but we haven't found a good translation yet.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so another different layer of how we are related, you and me, is that you spent some time in Paris and you wrote a memoir, actually, that's called Busker, Stories from the Streets of Paris. So can you tell us about that? Like both, like when was that in your life and then how you came to write a memoir?
So, well, I always wanted to be a writer, but I had this idea that I had to live something extraordinary in order to have something to write about. So I wasn't writing seriously until after I moved to Paris. And so they're two separate entities, the living in Paris and playing music on the street. But I found that, so I moved to Paris in 2005, so a long time ago now. Yeah. So I was pretty young. I just graduated university and didn't really know what to do with my life. And so that's what I did with my life. I moved to Paris and didn't have much to fall back on except for my violin. And so I just started to play in the streets. I didn't even speak French at the time. So I had a lot of learning to do, and a lot of living ended up happening because I would meet so many different people, and you're basically asking for fate to get involved in your life when you're busking like that, especially in a foreign country. So I started writing about the things that were happening in my busking life in Paris, because they were strange and interesting and funny and sometimes scary and sad. So when I was living in Paris, I guess after about a year of pure living, then I started writing about living. It just seemed to be like the natural thing to write about. So that's what I did. I started writing in 2006, but you know, it wasn't until 10 years later that the memoir actually got published. It was a really long process to learn to write and find what my true voice was. And I think, you know, I don't know why. I guess it doesn't take that long for everybody, but that's how long it took for me.
Yeah, well, that makes me feel good because I started writing a memoir. I told you about it like 2 or 3 years ago, and it's on hold now, but it makes me feel better that it can be on hold. And like you said, like some stories are not ready to come out yet or something. So it's okay.
I think it's the same for books, you know, they have their own timeline.
Yeah.
And I remember a writer friend telling me, like, I was working on the memoir and it was in such rough shape. And she said, you know, books have their time. And, you know, she firmly believed that books are published when it's their time. And you can't fast track that either. Like, I would be so horrified if the first time I thought that the memoir was ready to be published, if it had been published in that state, I would, you know, I'd be horrified every waking moment.
Yeah, and so this ties into live storytelling. Tell us the origin story of why you started telling stories on stage.
So I spent many years alone writing this memoir, and then I probably read somewhere online that, like, if you're a writer, you should, you know, attend writer events and read your work, or like find your community, that kind of thing. So I looked at the local writing community and I saw this ad that was like looking for storytellers or fiction writers. Yeah. So I contacted that person and I suggested a chapter from my memoir that I would read. And he accepted and put me on the show. And so I showed up to read a chapter from my memoir, and I was the only one reading. Everyone else was just telling a story. They were doing this thing called true life storytelling that I had never even heard of before. And I noticed that the audience was a lot more engaged, including myself. And Paul was there. Paul Aflalo was a storyteller that night. So I just remember something really special was happening. Yeah. And it was too late for me. I already had my pages, so I went up and I read my chapter, and it was fun, and people liked it. But I realized that I could maybe try this storytelling myself, because I had all these stories. They were all written, but maybe I could adapt it the way that these people had done. And so the next time I signed up to be on the show, I took a risk and I told a story from the memoir, but it was adapted. So the language wasn't as stiff, and it was a lot more condensed, and I could just tell it in my speaking voice instead of my writing voice. And it was a very, it changed my life, because I realized that I could, it was it's like learning a new instrument or something. Like I have a new way of communicating. I have a new way of telling my story. So I'd been telling stories ever since. That was at a different show called Yarn that is no longer in operation. But from Yarn, I started attending Confabulation. And it was it was one of those 2-minute storytelling nights, my first Confabulation, and a whole bunch of storytellers dropped out. Yeah. And someone recognized me from the Yarn show and was like, "Oh, you're a storyteller. You can do this." So that was my first initiation to Confabulation. It was almost on the spot, like tell a 2-minute story.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
And fate came to grab you say this way.
Yeah, totally.
Nice. And now you are going to tell a story on my show, and I'm so happy.
Yeah, finally.
Yeah, and you so this is on July 12th. The theme is firsts. You also referred a Montreal storyteller to me for this show, and you are helping me because you had started working with her on her story. So you helped workshop her story for the show. So I'm so glad we get to collaborate. It's really cool.
Me too.
So everyone, come to the show. Nisha is an outstanding storyteller, and I'm just so proud to call you my friend, and I'm so excited for the show. Thank you for talking to me today. It's so insightful, and I hope everyone goes to shows, shares their stories, and become a storytelling producer. You can do it. You've got this, so I'll talk to you soon. Any last words?
No, just thanks for chatting with me, Brune. It's been fun, and I can't wait to be part of the show.
Cool. All right, see you on Sunday.
Okay.